Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to talk about writers and works pertaining to Old English literature or Anglo-Saxon literature. But before we move ahead, it is very important to note that in the Anglo-Saxon period, poems were given more importance. Prose came in much later. So we will be predominantly talking about poems and poets today in this lecture. There are three types of poems: heroic, lyric, and Christian poetry. Except for a few scattered poems, most of the Old English poetic material that we possess were recorded in four manuscripts. And the four most famous manuscripts are Versailles Book, Exeter Book, Junius Manuscript, and the Novel Codex. We need to talk about all of these three kinds of poetry one by one, so let's begin now. I will talk about the first poetry of Anglo-Saxon period, which is Beowulf. It is known as the greatest heroic poem written in Old English. It was written in the 7th century BC and we still do not know who wrote it, and the length of the poem is about 3000 lines. Unlike normal poems, it doesn't rhyme as far as the poetic structure is concerned. This poem has a lot of alliteration and stress poetic lines. A very important fact from the exam point of view is that the famous writer J.R.R. Tolkien has illustrated many of the features of Old English poetry in his 1940 essay on translating Beowulf. And another notable writer, Mr. William Morris, also translated Beowulf. So that was about it, and I'll give you a brief summary about this poem. So this poem is set in Denmark, and it is a story about very brave man called Beowulf. So it is named after him. Now this man was a young warrior from southern Sweden, and he was sent to Denmark to help King Hrothgar. The king had a great hall where people used to sit. However, a lake monster called Grendel used to trouble the king and the people. Our hero Beowulf fought with the monster barehanded and killed him. Grendel's mother came to seek revenge, but he killed her too. So first he killed the monster and then he killed his mother. Later this young brave man became the king and ruled his country peacefully for 50 years. After 50 years, another dragon attacked his country. He fought with the dragon but was wounded deeply in the fight and he passed away. After his death, his attendants cremated his body and erected a tower in his memory. So that was all about this poem. The next heroic poem is Voltaire. This poem is about the legend of Walter of Aquitaine, and Walter means king. It tells the story of Voltaire and Hildegard, who fallen in love and steal treasure from Attila's court, where they are being held captive. Two men, Guthère, the Burgundian king, and Hagina are on the lookout for Voltaire and Hildegard. These two men are looking for Voltaire and Hildegard's treasure. The poem is about a conflict between the two parties that is about to occur. Moving to the third poetry, which is Fight at Finnsburg. So this Old English heroic poem talks about the battle in which Hanif and his 60 retainers are at fort called Finn's Fort, where they are defending themselves by keeping the attackers away from attacking the fort. The fourth and the last important heroic poem is Widsith. It is also known as the Traveler's Song. The poem talks about the people, kings, and heroes of Europe in the heroic age of Northern Europe. This poem is found in manuscript named Exeter Book. Now we will move on to the lyric poetry. The first lyric poetry that we will discuss today is Wanderer. So in this poem there is an old man who recalls an attack that happened in his youth. So in this attack his family and friends were killed. The memories of this attack are still with him. So in the poem he preaches that one should remain calm and resolve matters peacefully rather than fighting and killing people. Next up we have seafarer. So seafarer is the another name for a sailor, someone who travels by sea frequently. The poem describes about the life of a sailor. It describes harsh reality of life at sea in the winter. He compares the anxious feeling, cold wetness and loneliness of sea voyage with life on land when men are surrounded by friends and family, safe from danger and well fed. Despite everything, the poet still yearns for the sea voyage. So this poem has been translated several times by, most notably by Ezra Pound, one of the most famous American poets. Let's move on to the next lyric poetry. It's called Wife's Lament. The focus of the poem is on the female speaker's grief and her state of despair. The female speaker expresses her deep sorrow over her husband's departure. Moving on to another important lyric poem, which is Dior's Lament. So, Dior is a singer who has been banished by his lord. He is very attached to his lord and so he mourns. Later, to get over his grief, he tries to console himself by recalling other people's sorrow. He tells himself a very famous line that we all use in times of sorrow, and the line is, "This too shall pass." He is hopeful that one day his Lord will forgive him and call him again. And the last lyric poetry that we are covering is Husband's Message. The poem tells the story about a man who was forced to leave his homeland and his wife after the war ended. The now wealthy and established husband write a message for his wife on a plank of wood. He sent it to her, reflecting on his past bad luck, professing his love for her and requesting her to join with him in his new home. With this, we have covered all the lyric poetry. Now we will be talking about Christian poetry. We start with a notable Christian poet. The first poem is Caedmon. This is the story of a young shepherd called Caedmon who cannot sing. So in the monastery, there is a practice of passing the harp. Harp is a type of musical instrument, as we all know. So this one is similar to the game of passing the pillow, where the person who gets the pillow has to do a task. So in the Anglo-Saxon time, whoever has the harp has to sing. So people do not pass on the harp to Caedmon due to lack of singing skills because they don't want to hear his Besura singing. So one day, Caedmon has a dream. He sees God and God tells him to write and sing about his creation. So when Caedmon wakes up, he is able to write beautifully and even sing very well. So he sometimes credited as being the first English poet. He is called Anglo-Saxon Milton because just like Caedmon, even John Milton wrote about God. Caedmon's only known surviving work is Caedmon's Hymn and the 9-line alliterative vernacular praise poem in honor of God, which is supposedly learned to sing in his initial dream. The next notable poem is Bede, his most well-known work in history of English people. This is written in Latin and the book focuses on the history of development of Christianity in England and is written in, of course, Old English. The book was written in Latin but translated to Old English by King Alfred. So Bede tells an interesting tale in the book about Caedmon. So this is also about our previous poem, only in a way because they are going to talk about Caedmon here. So moving on to the next one, which is Cynulf. He is famous for his religious compositions and it's regarded as, one of the most preeminent figures of Anglo-Saxon Christian poetry. Cynulf became popular because he was one of the few poets who signed his poems. Now we will talk about one of the most famous Christian poetry. The name of the poem is Dream of the Rood. So Rood means the cross of Jesus Christ. The poem follows the dream of the narrator. The narrator is having a conversation with the cross and the poem has 3 sections. In the first part, the narrator has a vision of the cross. In the second part, the cross tells the story of Jesus' death. The cross is then resurrected and adorned with gold and silver, just like Christ. It is regarded as superior to all the trees, just like Jesus is regarded as superior to all men. In section 3, the author gives reflection about the vision. The vision fades away, leaving the man alone with his thoughts. He praises God for what he has witnessed and is filled with hope for eternal life as well as desire to be near the glorious cross once more. With this, we have summarized the Anglo-Saxon poetry. Now we quickly brush up Anglo-Saxon prose, and they didn't bring prose with them. They brought with them their own poetry as they believed that poems were artistic. Prose developed due to Christianization in England. King Alfred, who was the ruling king of the time, made a huge contribution to Anglo-Saxon prose. Let's find out how. He encouraged education, proposing the primary education must be taught in English rather than in Latin. Latin was the dominant language of Britain before Anglo-Saxon introduced English. He translated several books, many of them religious, from Latin into Old English. He started Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, periodical publication that continued for 300 years. It provides a very detailed historical record of Anglo-Saxon period. So with this, we come to the end of the video. I hope you are able to brush up all your basics. I will return soon with a brand new video. Until then, keep working hard and studying literature. So that's it from my side. We'll soon see you in the next lecture. Stay tuned to my channel. Literature Makes Sense.